Hi everybody, this is Ms. Peachy from your WCA biology class, and this is my third video supplemental for biology semester B. Today we will be looking at genetic drift and gene flow. So just those two things. We actually will be talking about speciation in the next video supplemental. So before today, or before this video, we were looking at evolution by natural selection. And the two things that I emphasize when we talk about evolution by natural selection has to do with fitness, right? Because remember, when you think about evolution by natural selection, you think survival of the fittest. And what does it mean to be fit? Well, being fit in the case of evolution by natural selection is having the traits, the adaptations that increase your survivability, and so you have to survive, but you also have to reproduce and pass those genes on to the next generation. So anything that helps you to reproduce or survive and reproduce is something that is making you more fit, according to the theory of evolution by natural selection. So we have to think about that when we think about characteristics. Now remember, characteristics or traits in genetics, we call those phenotypes. So an observable characteristic is a phenotype. So I'm going to use the term phenotype sometimes. Phenotypes or traits are determined by genes. And there are different kinds of genes called alleles. Okay, so let's put that on the next screen here. Let's actually just do a new screen here real quick. Okay. Here we have our traits. Okay, which are also known as phenotypes, right? And these are determined by I gotta get a better pen here for writing. Determined by genes. There are different kinds of genes which are called alleles, right? So alleles would be, for example, the gene might be eye color, but the allele would be blue or brown. So it's a type of gene. So the traits, the phenotypes that allow you to be more or less fit are determined by genes. And that's what gets passed on to the next generation. So in natural selection, if you have a trait that gives you better fitness, say you're faster, or you can jump far, or something like that, that improves your ability to survive and reproduce, then your offspring will have that trait as well, or has a better likelihood of having that trait. So we also talk about change over time, and sometimes I use like the phrase change in allele frequency, which is a really kind of complex phrase to use. When you use that phrase, what you're really looking at is, let's say you have a population here. I'm just going to put it in a box to represent that they're one population. And let's say we have a population of, say, lizards. And these lizards live on this one rock outcropping. Okay, so they live on a rock that's primarily gray in color. So I'm actually going to draw just like this rock that they live on, and the rock is gray. Okay? I don't know if I can change my color pen. Oh, apparently not. I didn't want to do that. Oh, here we go. I can change it up here. This is a new thing for me, guys. Sorry about that. So I'm going to pick a grayish color. It's probably going to look more, black than gray, but there's a rock, right? And on this rock, we have lizards. And on the lizards, 80% of those lizards are gray. And only 20% of them are green. Now on the rock outcropping, there's also some little patches of moss. So it's okay for some of those lizards to be green, but there's not as much, green areas. Now the reason why gray is an advantage here is because they blend in, right? It gives them camouflage. And the birds that like to eat the lizards will more likely not eat them if they're camouflaged, right? But what happens is we see a change in the environment here. So over time, perhaps the environment changes, it warms up and becomes wetter and warmer. And now this rock, still gray, still a gray rock. But now we see more moss forming. More patches of moss, bigger patches of moss. The rock is almost covered with moss. Okay? It's a very mossy rock. So on our mossy rock, we now see that we have 70% green lizards. This, by the way, should have said green down here too. And only 30% gray. This is called a change in allele frequency. Or we can call it a change in the phenotypic frequency. They're pretty much the same thing. We see more of the green alleles in the population than we did before. And this is because of the environmental change, and because of the environmental change, the color to be the most fit also changed, right? So now it's more of an advantage to be green because you have a better chance of blending in than it is to be gray. So again, that's called the selection pressure. The selection pressure here is that the environment changed, and they're also, being a meal, being a prey is a part of that pressure, and that changed the allele frequency. That's evolution by natural selection. Evolution is the change in allele frequency, and natural selection is because of fitness. Now sometimes something can happen, and there can be a change in allele frequency when there's not a change in fitness. Okay? So let's say we have a sidewalk. And on the sidewalk, there are beetles. There are green beetles and there are brown, oops, let's try that one more time. Still learning to use this. The sidewalk, there are beetles. There are green beetles and there are brown beetles. So I'm going to draw a bunch of green beetles. And I'm going to draw a bunch of brown beetles. Maybe the brown beetles are a lot more abundant than the green beetles. There's just a lot more of them. So at the beginning, it's pretty rare to be a green beetle. So initially in the sidewalk, the ratio of green beetles to brown beetles, let's say we have 70% brown and 30% green. Now let's say somebody just decides to walk on the sidewalk. Well, it's a sidewalk and all. It really isn't that big of a deal for them to walk on it. Whoa! Sorry guys, I have no idea why that zoomed. Let's not zoom. Let's not zoom. I honestly don't know why it zoomed. I don't know how to unzoom it. Shoot. Oh, here we go. There, I got it. Sorry about that. So we have Somebody walking on the sidewalk, right? And as they're walking, they're squishing beetles. Now, they're not doing this on purpose. They're just walking and not paying attention. But they just so happen to step on and squish way more brown beetles than they do green beetles. So there's like a mass destruction of brown beetles going on here. After the big squishing event of 2019, you have a whole bunch of these brown beetles that just got killed. Boom, boom, boom. This guy just totally massacred brown beetles. I mean, it's ridiculous how many brown beetles he killed. Just by chance. He didn't really step on any green ones. Maybe a couple, but not very many. So after, we'll call this the BBM, the brown beetle massacre. Post brown beetle massacre, you now have a population that's only about 40% brown beetle and about 60% green. You have a change in the allele frequency, just like we did before. But this had nothing to do with the fitness. Being a brown beetle wasn't an unfit situation. There was nothing wrong with being a brown beetle. You just got in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so brown beetles got killed. So because it had nothing to do with the fitness, we call this situation, instead of natural selection, this is just called genetic drift. So genetic drift is a change in the allele frequency by something that has nothing to do with the fitness of those alleles, those traits, okay? And that changes the frequency of that allele in the population. And sometimes it's a temporary thing, and you can see a rebound in the brown beetles over time. And sometimes it's a permanent change, depending on how many of them got killed, right? So let's look at some incidences where we see genetic drift. We talked about the brown beetle massacre already. Okay, that's one incident. But there are other ones. For example, there's one called the founder effect, where in this case we have a small population that has been isolated from a larger population. And because the population is small, you've reduced the genetic variation in that population. There's just fewer different types of organisms that were there before. An example here is the Dutch settlers in South Africa, called the Afrikaner population. In this case, this small colony of people created a larger population from the small colony. But because they were isolated, they didn't have a lot of people coming in and providing new genetics, they have a very limited number of variations in their population because it was a very isolated and very small population. Okay. Another one is called the bottleneck effect. And in this case, you maybe started with a large population and then you had some event that drastically reduced the size of the population. And that event had nothing to do with the fitness of any of the organisms in that population. It was just an event. The brown beetle squishing, by the way, would be considered a bottleneck event. Okay? So when it reduces the variation, sometimes some of those varieties don't make it through the bottlenecking event. You see here the yellow ones, they didn't make it through. And so the surviving population will repopulate and make an entirely brand new bottle full of little colored balls here, but they won't have yellow ones anymore. So that allele is just gone from the gene pool because of the bottlenecking event. And it's obviously not an actual bottle and it's not actual beads, but it just kind of gives you an analogy here. An example of a bottlenecking event would be the greater prairie chicken. The greater prairie chicken, it was drastically reduced in size, the population of greater prairie chicken, because of habitat destruction. So it didn't have anything to do with the fitness of the chickens. is just because the majority of the habitat of the greater prairie chicken was lost as people colonized and moved into that area and began to, farm it and stuff like that. They just got rid of the natural habitat of the greater prairie chicken. Problem was that when you looked at the greater prairie chicken population, we can see here that in the bright blue, that's where we see them currently. And in the past, they kind of spread all the way, through the Great Plains, the Great Lakes area into Canada, even down as far south as Texas. So it had a greater, much further geographic distribution. These areas were still pretty, there's still quite a few chickens here and stuff like that. But then you get these little tiny colonies right here in Illinois, right here in Missouri. These were isolated. And there was only a small number of chickens to survive in those areas. So only the genes that were found in that gene pool would be able to be passed on to the next generation. And in some cases, this can be a bad gene. So there was a gene in the population in these smaller areas that actually reduced the survivability of eggs. So there was a gene that actually caused weaker eggs, and then the eggs wouldn't hatch. And then it was really radically reducing the population of prairie chickens that remained. So what they ended up having to do, you can see this here. So this is pre-bottleneck event in 1820. Then all that habitat destruction, you just have a little bitty bit of prairie chickens left. Unfortunately, those prairie chickens had the gene or the allele for bad egg, if you will. And so you see a very small number of them hatching. In Kansas, where we don't see the bottleneck over here, because most of the chickens survived, you don't see a reduction in the number of chickens that will hatch. You still have 99% that are hatching. Whereas in Illinois, you're seeing less than 50% hatch. I think what they ended up having to do was they actually brought in chickens from Kansas to Illinois to add more variety to the gene pool to actually increase the hatch rate. And they did that and were able to increase the hatch rate up to 90%. But that is considered a bottleneck event because you're taking a big population and you're just drastically reducing the size and therefore reducing the genes found within that population. All right, so with genetic drift, this is very significant, but only in small populations. It's not a big deal in large populations, okay? Bottlenecking is also about small populations, but it's about taking a large population and reducing it down to a small population. It causes changes in allele frequency at random. It has nothing to do with the fitness of the organism. It can lead to a loss of genetic population. It can cause changes that are permanent if you get rid of entire alleles. In this case here, that yellow allele is gone. So bottlenecking can actually cause entire alleles to go extinct. But again, because it has nothing to do with fitness, it's not natural selection. It's not truly considered evolution in that respect. Okay? Now another term I just want to define real quick here is gene flow. Gene flow is the movement of alleles into and out of a population. If you isolate a population, you've completely stopped gene flow. You're not getting any new DNA in, and nobody's leaving with that DNA, right? So gene flow is very important. By having new genes coming into a population, you're constantly able to improve the fitness and adapt when the environment changes, when things change, when the rock becomes more mossy and stuff like that. It's important that there's variety, because if there's not variety, everybody dies. So this leads us to our last thing, which is called the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. This is a hypothetical situation that rarely occurs. The Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium states that if these 5 conditions are met, that there will be no natural selection, no evolution occurring, okay? No change in allele frequency. So you don't have mutations There'd be no genetic mutations occurring. You would have you would have random mating. That's important. So you're not selecting your mate. You're just randomly mating. And that doesn't happen very often in populations. It does a lot of times in like populations of fish, for example, where you have broadcast fertilization. Just in the water, sperm and eggs are just broadcast and come together at random. That's more of a random mating event, right? But in general, a lot of animals will select their mates based on their mating dance maybe, or their coloration, or something like that. So there's selection that occurs there. No natural selection. In other words, no traits that make it either more or less likely for you to survive. That's what we mean by no natural selection. There is no advantageous traits. Extremely large population sizes and no gene flow, so no new genes coming in or out. If all 5 of these conditions are met, there will be no evolution. But the idea of Hardy-Weinberg is that it's a very fictitious situation, and it never occurs where all 5 things are stagnant. You're always going to have some gene flow. If you don't have gene flow, you're certainly going to have mutations. Even if you don't have random mating, or even if you do have random mating, like with the fish, you're still going to have, certain traits that make you more or less likely to survive. So it will never be a case where you will have all 5 conditions met at the same time. Okay? Hopefully that helped, guys. And that's the end of this biology tutorial. If you have any questions, you guys know where to contact me, and I hope you have a great day.